Word reparation evokes lots of emotions depending on who you're talking to. But no matter how you feel about the word, and more importantly, the concept, one thing is clear, and that's the reality that the once considered fringe extremist term and concept is now very much in the mainstream and on the minds of lots of folks, lots of state legislators, as well as our federal government. Today, we're talking to experts and folks from a small Black town in Oklahoma who are demanding reparations and shining a spotlight on decades-old government policies that have ravaged Black towns around the country. And we're asking, is the fight for reparations getting closer to being won? And what does reparations look like, depending on where you are and what community you're from? All coming up next.
Los Angeles. This is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
The all-Black town of Tallahassee, Oklahoma was once a thriving community, but it, like many cities, was ravaged by government policies that divested from it. This town says it's owed reparations to get back on its feet. Reparations has moved from the fringes to the mainstream of political discourse. Experts say this is a result of years of protest and resistance movements which highlight the generational damage and harm of enslavement and the legacies of slavery, including racially discriminatory housing, economic, and financial policies that have denied Black people and communities from the same opportunities and wealth as white folks. The story of Tallahassee and its fight for reparations was spotlighted in a recent Washington Post article. This article raises bigger issues about the question of reparations. Here for my leadoff discussion is the author of that Washington Post article, Emmanuel Felton. He is a race and ethnicity author, journalist, editor for the Washington Post. Good morning, Emmanuel.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. I want to start by asking you, so for those folks who don't know where this little town in Oklahoma is, it's a tiny little town with 88 residents, I think, or 83 or
83,
something.
yeah.
83 folks, so not even a full house party. How did you learn about them, and how did they become the subject of such a long and thoughtful piece?
Yeah, so Tallahassee has been out front in a way that you don't expect a town this small to be. So Tallahassee got on our radar because there's this MORE Commission, which is this commission of mayors organized for reparations, founded by the former mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti. And Tallahassee was one of the members, was one of the founding members, right? So it's 12 mayors around the country, and Tallahassee was one. So it ranges from, population 4 million LA down to this small town. So that's how they got on our radar, because they are thinking through these topics in a way that I have not seen a town that small really do so far.
Well, just for correcting the record, and as a journalist, I'm sure you'll appreciate this, Mayor Garcetti is still the mayor of Los Angeles. He hasn't been confirmed to
I did not realize that.
ambassadorship yet. And if you read some articles in your paper, it's a little shaky. Not sure what's going to happen with that. So you may be here for a little while longer. But you're right. This commission that's formed by these 12 different cities, Mayor Garcetti is a part of it. And then we have this little small town, 83 members versus LA, which has 4 million residents. But this city is different in a lot of ways too, because unlike some of the cities that are part of this coalition, this town is a Black town that's seeking reparations. So it's not like, white cities across the country that are finding ways to make good, based on the harms that were done to its Black residents. What makes that stand out in terms of this town?
Yeah, exactly. Its relationship to reparations is one I haven't seen yet, and I've been covering this for a little while now, right? So, cities like LA, Denver, Asheville, North Carolina, they're thinking like, how do we repay the Black families that our own policies have caused generational harm to, right? So you look at a place like Evanston, Illinois, which they have a new reparations program that's providing $25,000 cash assistance for housing if you can show that your family was in Evanston, was a Black family in Evanston between 1919 and 1969 when redlining was the law of the day, right? So you have those cities that are looking for ways to use policies to correct the harms that they've caused. Tallahassee, on the other hand, was the victim of government policies, right? So Tallahassee was this thriving town, this mecca for Black people who were interested in creating something separate, really, and something substantial that couldn't be created in a lot of the rest of the country. They all gathered in these Oklahoma towns before Oklahoma was a state, so it was still a territory, and then Oklahoma became a state and passed many of the same Jim Crow laws that that these Black people were fleeing to when they came to towns like Tallahassee.
So we've heard a lot recently about Greenwood and Black Wall Street. And so when you think of Oklahoma, you think of thriving Black cities, you're thinking of that Greenwood community. What's the relationship, if any, between Tallahassee and Greenwood?
So Greenwood was the big town, right? So, some of the older folks I talked to, they remember their parents getting in the car and going to Greenwood often. So there was this relationship. Tallahassee is only about 40 miles east of Tulsa. So there was this close relationship. And then when the massacre happened, when Greenwood was destroyed, there was a lot of fear in the rest of these Black towns too, because Greenwood really wasn't an anomaly at this time. There had been these successful Black towns popping up across Oklahoma because it existed outside of the traditional Jim Crow system, right? So all of these towns are popping up. Greenwood's one is a part of Tulsa, and then Tallahassee's one, and then when the massacre happened, there was just a lot of fear. And it really helped start the exodus of folks out of Tallahassee, moving further west, still hoping to find opportunity in America.
So we know the massacre that you're talking about that happened to Greenwood when that town was essentially destroyed was around 1921, right?
Right.
So do you date the decline of Tallahassee to that 1921 time period, or did it happen before or later?
Yeah, it was a series of things, right? So first, Oklahoma becomes a state in 1907. Before that, it was Indian territory, and there was no Jim Crow, right? So in 1907, Oklahoma becomes a state. One of the very first pieces of legislation they passed is a Jim Crow law. So that already starts to wane the influence of these towns, right? There's less people willing to move to Oklahoma because of that. And then comes along Greenwood. And you see this terror, and you see that the government won't protect you. And that was another blow for these towns. And then I would say the final blow was the Great Depression. So towns, Black and white, were affected by the Great Depression, obviously. But Black towns could not get a loan anywhere in Oklahoma. Black businesses couldn't get a loan anywhere in Oklahoma. And so those three events really took what was a thriving town and caused it to shrivel to what we see today.
You've been covering this topic of race, ethnicity, Black communities. That's been a part of your professional journey. What do you think is the most important thing that has happened that has caused this conversation about reparations to move from the fringes to now become a part of this mainstream political discourse where towns, like you said, like Evanston, Illinois, we see this happening in Rhode Island, Michigan now has a piece of legislation passed around reparations. Cities like Detroit, they're talking about reparations. So you get these pockets. Of course, California is the biggest state that has this reparations commission that's been formed that's really making a lot of progress. So from your work as a journalist, having studied these issues, what's moving this from the fringe into the mainstream?
I think it's really interesting. I think there was this knee-jerk reaction that Black Lives Matter was a failure, that these protests did not add up to the sort of the quick legislation, not really the quick, but the legislation that we saw during the civil rights movement, right? Like there wasn't a clear, like this happened, like the march on from Selma to Montgomery and then the Voting Rights Act, right? So there wasn't that clear link to policy. But I think what we're seeing though, is it did change the conversation, right? And that conversation, It's interesting because like they were asking for something big. They were asking for the reformulation at a basic level of America. And so it hasn't been as direct. It hasn't been as quick. But I think what we're seeing is this is the aftermath of that. I mean, so many of the folks that I talk to who have been on this issue for decades now say that it was the murder of George Floyd changed this conversation. For the first time, you could have a conversation about, and I think the years of protests leading up to that had already laid the groundwork, right? About systemic racism, about redlining, about all of these issues that for so long were sort of academic, but in the last 5 to 10 years have really entered the public discourse in large part because of activists.
And have you seen a change in, so I hear what you're saying about folks who've been working on this for a long time saying they're seeing a change because of George Floyd's murder and the worldwide protests that follow that. But public opinion because public opinion historically has been anti-reparations. We've had people come out very vocally and very, strident in their opposition to the concept of reparations. Have you seen any change in public opinion outside of African-American community around reparations?
Yes. So it is still it's still underwater. There's still more people against reparations than for reparations. But what we have seen in the last 30 years is a marked increase among white Democrats and their support for reparations. So it's above water with Black folks. It's still underwater with white Democrats, but that is—
How much underwater? When we say underwater, is it like 60-40, 70-30?
It's a good question, and I'm blanking right now, but I remember the total moved from about 19% support to just around 40% support. So it's no longer like this completely fringe idea. So there's definitely been movement. And then you look at what's happening on Capitol Hill, right? So for the first time in 30 years, their supporters are saying they have the votes in the House to pass this law that John Conyers started advocating for right after Japanese Americans got reparations for internment camps, right? So 30 years later, there's this unquestionable movement. And what they're calling for, the Democrats in Congress, is we have the votes in the House, we don't have the votes in the Senate.
Hold on a second, Emmanuel. They have the votes for what?
For a study bill. So this bill, right? This bill would study the issue of reparations and make formal recommendations on what should come next, what the government should do next.
And we know Biden has stated support for a study bill, but you're saying that the House doesn't believe that they have the votes in the Senate.
Exactly. So what they're saying is—
let me ask you this, even amongst Senate Democrats, they don't have the votes?
Oh, well, they don't have the 51 votes. Let's say that. Like, I haven't seen their math, and I would imagine there are a few Democrats that they don't have. But what I've heard so far is they have 0 Republican support, which would make passage in the Senate near impossible. So they don't have the votes in the Senate. Joe Biden, during the primaries, expressed interest in a reparations study bill. This is the same process that Japanese Americans went through to get reparations in the 80s, right? So there's a study bill, and then that led to legislation in Congress that led to actual money. So the question is, will Biden sign an executive order? And that's what the House of Representatives, Democrats in the House, are asking him to do.
Yeah, that was my next question. Obviously, unlikely that with this Senate, as it is currently comprised, that they get the 60 votes they would need. So the question is, what is the White House prepared to do independently? And what are your sources telling you about that?
They're optimistic. I mean, we haven't seen movement. They feel like the clock is running out too, because it calls for an 18-month study bill or study. They would like that to be completed before Biden left office, in case, who knows what happens in 2024. So yeah, they're pushing him hard. I was surprised by their optimism, and they're going to him with these numbers that show it is increasingly not in the fringe of the political conversation anymore.
So I know what's happening in California, and we'll talk with some California, historians and experts a little later in the program. I mentioned Michigan, but are there any other states like California or Michigan that have taken up the issue of reparations in any kind of substantial way?
Not yet, but there's talk in New Jersey, there's talk in New York, there's talk in Maryland of mirroring what California has done. So it's definitely it's a conversation happening in deep blue state halls as we speak.
What do you think happens? Because one of the things that we're going to talk about a little later with California is this whole division over who should be included,
Right.
what reparations look like. So we know there are lots of debates going on. But if each state, and in some cases like Evanston, little towns like Evanston, which is tiny compared to Chicago and definitely not the state of Illinois, if each takes its own approach, comes up with its own definition, its own, pool of who receives reparations, do you think that helps or hurts the movement?
I think it's really interesting. I think, California is grappling with that right now, right? Like you said, there's this huge conversation last week or the week before last about who gets it. Is it all Black people, or is it just Black people who are descendants of slaves who were brought to this continent or to this country, not even the continent, right? So there's that conversation. And okay, so let's say California does that. So what is California providing reparations for? I think is also an interesting question, right? Yes, there is slavery in California, but very few of the Black people in California are descendants of slave or people who were enslaved in California, right? So I think it's very interesting. It's definitely messy. What I think is really interesting though is each community, each government, layer of government taking responsibility for what it did personally, right? So Evanston we didn't have slaves, but we did redline. We did keep Black people out of our community, right? So they're looking to take responsibility for what they did. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what California is taking responsibility for, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, then that's an interesting question, Emmanuel, because one of the things that's come up in this debate, whether it's California or some other, jurisdiction, is are we making amends for slavery or the vestiges of slavery, right, or the current systemic, pervasive racism that African Americans and Black people, whether you're Caribbean or African American, face? What are you hearing about that part? Because that's huge, right? Is it slavery? Is it Jim Crow and the aftermath of slavery? Is it, Donald Trumpism? Is
right.
it, what is it?
I mean, that was a big part of the debate in California, right? It's we're not just trying to repair slavery. We're trying to repair everything that's come since slavery. And this, it does get a little confusing. Okay, so who are you owed reparation? Because you're not talking about specifically American slaves then. You're talking about every Black person who's lived in California since California became a state. I mean, there's been policies that were negative for Black folks. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I don't think anyone's figured it out. And that's why I have been most impressed by these smaller programs like Evanston, like Tallahassee, that are specifically saying, here's what you did wrong. I want amends for that. And I think that might be the future, because I think, I'm very interested to see what happens out of California, but I think we've already seen that it's a bit messy. And so how do you grapple with that? It's going to be an interesting conversation.
Well, back to Tallahassee, what's the response from the government? Is the state of Oklahoma embracing this, these requests for reparations? Is it prepared to make compensation to those 83 residents?
Right. Yeah, I think they're figuring that. I mean, so what I will say is the lieutenant governor, who's a Republican, is on their reparations committee, is looking for ways to make right what happened in Tallahassee. Because yeah, it's interesting, right? This is happening in one of the most conservative states in the country. So I think their fight moving ahead is really interesting, because they're using language that I don't know how receptive it is in the Capitol, right? In Oklahoma City. So far they've walked that tightrope really successfully, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens next.
Yeah, and so far no commitment, obviously, from the Oklahoma state legislature or the governor to get on board with any reparations for those 83 citizens of Tallahassee?
I mean, so what they're saying is what we're doing is we're pumping in resources to this town, and that's our form of reparation, since our policies actively divested in this town. But so far, I haven't seen many resources pumped in.
Okay, and I assume, Emmanuel, you're going to follow this story. Very interesting. I mean, this is, again, a town that probably no one's heard of. Yep. We've all heard of Greenwood and Black Wall Street, but very interesting to see what happens. And to the extent you're going to do something around reparations, what a perfect town, right, to use as a model. One, because it's not going to cost you a whole lot of money. You can go give everybody $100,000 and it's
Right.
still not like
Right.
touch the surface of the state's coffers because
Right.
you're talking about so few people versus, I don't know, California has, I don't know, 2, 3 million African Americans. So you're talking about a whole different model there.
No, and I mean, that was the idea of this Moore Commission, finding ways in different communities that have facing different challenges across the country to greenlight or to pilot what this might look like. And that's the question right now.
Well, thank you so much, Emmanuel, for your thoughtful piece on this topic and on this small town. And I'm sure they're quite happy to have their town highlighted in a big national publication like yours. And we're going to follow you and follow what happens with this story. Appreciate you sitting down with me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
My next guest is Charity Marcus. She is an economic development consultant for Tallahassee, Oklahoma. Good morning and welcome, Charity.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. I just wanted to ask you about this article in the Washington Post. I just had an opportunity to interview the author of that piece, and I want to know your opinion. Do you think he got it right? Did he accurately portray the conditions in Tallahassee?
I definitely think he portrayed the conditions of all of our small Black towns, our historic towns, especially here in Oklahoma. They used to be thriving communities, and now they are dwindled down to minimal population and really struggling to stay afloat.
Yeah, I know the Tallahassee from the article and from what the author unearthed when he was doing this piece can really trace his roots all the way back to like the 1850s. And according to the journalist, it was really impacted not only by Jim Crow laws, but even as recently as the 1990s by government policies that really devastated the economic base of that town. Is that your sense of why this town is in the condition that it's in today?
I think there are multiple factors into why the town has declined over the past decade. And it really started with the Tulsa Race Massacre. One of the things about Tallahassee is it's about 30 minutes from Tulsa and Black Wall Street. So when the massacre happened, that scared a lot of Black people, even in Tallahassee, to where they were thinking, oh my gosh, you know, I don't want that to happen to me. And starting there, it just has been a decline in population, which of course means a decline in economics, a decline in community.
So the piece of the big focus of this article was about reparations and the small town's fight for reparations. And of course, the whole conversation of reparations has moved from a fringe conversation to a much more mainstream conversation. When you think about this town's fight for reparations, what does that look like for you as an economic development advisor, for the mayor who's quoted heavily in this piece? What is the vision for you and the town when you think about reparations?
Yeah, I think we're in a unique position. A lot of reparations talks comes from predominantly white-led, white-founded towns and organizations giving back to Black communities and the Black population. Well, with Tallahassee, this is a Black town, you know, so it's not that we're giving reparations. It's about how do we create economic impact that's going to benefit our communities. And we look at that through economic development and saying, how can we partner with our state? How can we partner with our lieutenant governor to bring the funding in from the county, the state, and the federal government to rebuild this community?
You're right. Your town is very different. Most of the conversations, as you just stated, about reparations have to do with predominantly white cities and states that use laws to take property away from African Americans, to redline their communities in a way that made investments by other businesses impossible. And those white towns are trying to figure out ways to make African American communities whole. In your case, because it's always been a Black town, is there any sense that the town itself is responsible for what happened to it? And it's not some outside force, not some white, power structure or white legislature, legislative body that inflicted the harm on the town.
No, the town is definitely not responsible. There were still some policies that affected the town, like redlining, which is mentioned and talked about a lot. And then also we have to look at Tallahassee was a town given to Black Native Americans, our freedmen, after they were freed from slavery. So the town was created and given to them. The land there was given to them. Since then, in the 90s, other smaller towns that were predominantly white have come in and tried to encroach in terms of the city fence line. Which is one of the things that we're working on from an economic development standpoint is reestablishing the original boundaries. And Mayor Keisha Curran, she has been doing a great job over the past few years of annexing our land back into our town so that now we have land available for Black developers, Black investors, people who are looking to figure out how do we create Black wealth. Well, now we have the land here for you to make that happen.
So you are, the article says 83 residents. Is that number correct?
Yeah, 83 to about 100.
So if all goes well and you get the help of your county, your state, where does this town go?
So right now, I'm finishing out their economic development plan. We're focused on 6 points, which one of those is population growth. We are looking to build and increase our population. We're looking to increase our land mass. We're looking to increase the economic vitality of this city. And so moving forward, we're looking forward to at least having in the near future, at least 1,000 in our population, overall goal of 10,000 at minimum residents within the town.
Wow. What's the response been? I know you're working very closely with the University of Oklahoma. You mentioned the state government of Oklahoma. How are these entities responding to your desire to rebuild this town, to grow it from 83 residents to 10,000 residents?
Oh, the response is great. And a lot of people think that they're surprised because, Oklahoma is one of the most Republican states in the country. But we have the support of University of Oklahoma. They have been working with us going on their second year. We have Oklahoma State University helping out, the Langston University as well, too. And then we have the support of our Lieutenant Governor, Matt Pinnell, who is very heavily centered on tourism. And with our Black towns, we have 13 historic original Black towns where it is a huge tourism opportunity within the state. So he is focused and determined for our growth and development.
So I know most people think of Greenwood, the community that's very near your town. Everybody has heard recently, if they didn't know it before, they now have heard about Black Wall Street there in Tulsa. What is it that your town, when we think about Tallahassee, Oklahoma, many people have never heard of it, maybe just learning about it today, maybe learned about it in that Wash Post article. But what is it that you want folks to know about your town as you're trying to rebuild and grow your tourism?
That we are not, I'll say that Tallahassee is vibrant. We are not looking for a handout. We want to be a beacon, a shining light to say, this is where you can come and make it happen. Just like Tulsa and Black Wall Street, Black folks came from all over the country to move to Black Wall Street because they saw opportunity. And that's what we want for Tallahassee. Yes, the fight for reparations is great, but we're not waiting for reparations. We are looking to build with what we have. And I think that's a model that a lot of people miss with Black Wall Street, is that Black Wall Street wasn't built on reparations. It was built on Black entrepreneurs coming together and pulling their money and saying, we're going to build this. And so Tallahassee wants that same model of, yes, it's great if we can get the reparations and the support, but we're not going to wait on it. We're going to bring our resources together and we're going to build the community.
Just finally, what would reparations look like? When we have this discussion, there's some cities like Evanston, Illinois, that have made loans available for housing. for African Americans in that town. We've seen other examples throughout the country of some municipalities and states dipping their toe, I'll call it, into the water of reparations. But for you in Tallahassee, what would reparations look like from your, and assuming this is coming from the state government or the local county government?
Well, I'll say from my perspective, and it's hard because reparations looks different to everybody. But for me, and especially in terms of Edison, I don't think that reparations is in terms of loans. I think that communities and state governments and federal government, if we're doing reparations, it could be a cash payout. It could be
Would it be a cash payout to those 83 residents?
It could potentially be that, yes. It could be that. For me,
would you expect that to come from the state government or the federal government?
Again, I think it's more question. I think with the history of Oklahoma, with Tallahassee, we have Native Americans here, we have the state, and we have the federal government. So I think it would be a larger conversation to say really what entity is responsible for this. It could be all the entities. It could be only one or two of the entities. But for me, my focus, I can tell you now that I'm currently looking at how can we partner with the state and get state funding directly into the town.
So you're not looking for the state to give a cash payment. When you say funding into the town, what do you mean, like land grants? Do you mean, loans to businesses? What do you mean by that?
So right now we have an application out to the state for ARPA money. Oklahoma has $1.78 billion that they're giving away. So we're currently looking at about $30 million for our application to help rebuild our municipal building, our post office, civic center, police, fire department as a starting point. So grants, opportunities, we are looking at those tax incentives and some of the other programming that's available.
But that wouldn't technically be reparations, right? So this money is available to anyone in the state to apply for and to obtain.
Right.
Regardless of any harm that was done, regardless of any efforts that were made by the government to divest from this community, right? So that wouldn't truly be a form of reparation, would it?
I think, again, it depends on who you're talking to. Reparations is a larger conversation that is very dependent on the communities, whether you're looking at a community, whether you're looking at.
But I guess I'm trying to find out from your standpoint, is the mayor, because the article suggests that the mayor is on a mission, on a journey to get reparations. So when I hear you say you're applying for a grant that's available for anyone that's in the state, that doesn't sound like what people think of as traditional reparations, where you're redressing a harm by some form of compensation, whether it's, again, a loan program specifically tied to the harm that was done. So are there any efforts to ask the state or the federal government to give something back to the residents of this town tied specifically to the harm that the town believed it suffered?
Yeah, no, and I think that the mayor was misquoted in that part of it. The mayor is not actively seeking out reparations as a way to rebuild. She is open to that idea, but again, that's not her priority. Her priority is bringing in the resources by any means necessary to say, let's get this town rebuilt. But she does think that the residents definitely deserve reparations because they are descendants of slaves. They are descendants of freedmen from the Native American tribes here that had Black people as slaves, as well as the policies from redlining that harmed the community.
Okay, so there are two things happening. The mayor is asking for and seeking reparations for the individuals in the town, but she's also working on an economic development plan that's separate and apart from any argument in favor of reparations.
Correct.
Well, good luck to you. Sounds like you guys have your hands really full. Any feedback yet on the reparations piece? You've told me what's happening with economic development. Any response on any type of cash payment to these residents?
No update yet. Right now, we have joined the National More Coalition, and again, we're still trying to figure out how do we fit into that opportunity, because again, we are a Black town, so it's not like we're giving reparations or we've instilled harm to our residents. So it's really about trying to figure out how do we fit into this talk and into this conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Charity, for sitting down with me. Thank you for the work that you're doing. We're going to obviously continue to follow this story, as I'm sure the author and editor of that piece will continue to do as well, because this topic of reparations, much bigger conversation that's happening all over the country and actually, happening at the White House at this very moment. So again, thank you for your time and good luck to you with all of the economic development actions and initiatives that you have going on in the town.
Oh, and thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
All right. As I said, this whole issue of reparations, we have this conversation today because of that Washington Post article about that town in Oklahoma. But this is a much, much bigger conversation that's happening all over the country. And it's happening in real time in the state of California. So my next guests are actually in California. They are historians. They are experts on this topic. First, I have Dr. Charles Henry. He's a professor emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of Long Overdue, The Politics of Race. And also I have Dr. Julianne Malveaux. She's the Dean of Ethnic Studies at Cal State LA, and she is an economist and author. And her book is called Are We Better Off? Race, Obama, and Public Policy. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Henry and Dr. Malveaux.
Well, first of all, let me give Charles a shout out. I don't think we've seen each other in ages, but he used to be my boss.
You look just the same, Julianne, as you did 20 years ago the last time I saw you.
Well, I am super excited to be joined by two of California's most esteemed historians, experts, economists. This topic of reparations took a big step forward in California just this week with this vote about who should be included. Let me start with you, Dr. Henry. What do you think about the vote that was made by this reparations commission that was convened by the state of California? Basically, they decided to limit reparations to people who can trace their lineage to free or enslaved people living in the U.S. during the 19th century.
Well, I understand it was a divisive issue, and it was sort of meant to be. And the best I can understand from sort of reading the newspaper discussions and not having been a part of the meetings, although I have a Berkeley colleague who is on the commission, and I hope to get some more information at some point. But they followed the legislative history of the bill being introduced in California, which was, of course, generated by Dr. Shirley Weber. And in reading it, it seemed to be that her intent was that it applied to those who could trace their descendants back to at least one enslaved individual. And if you look at the most recent comprehensive discussion of reparations by Darity and Mullen, who are economists that I'm sure Dr. Malveaux knows, their book talks about being able to trace at least one of your descendants back to the enslaved and claiming your African-American heritage at least 12 years in advance of any of this. We're aware, for example, that when Native Americans were able to get some casino license, all of a sudden a number of people claimed to have Native American heritage that had denied it before. So there's that kind of check. So I think that's one way to look at it. Obviously, it's generated a good deal of discussion about those who have come to the United States more recently. I would add to that, though, that reparations is not just a U.S. issue, but an issue of the diaspora. And if, for example, you're a Jamaican American, Jamaica has a case for reparations against Britain. Barbados has a case against reparations for Britain, and there is activity going on there. So it's just not a sort of one thing fits all, but there are a number of cases of reparations, both against the state and private entities, that have to play into this conversation.
So you're right, Professor Henry. I would say there's more than discussion about this topic. There's actually a heated debate and some criticism that this task force has gotten for making this decision to narrow the scope to those individuals that can prove, their lineage back to slaves that were in the U.S. What do you think about this, Dr. Malveaux? This is such a heated topic when you start discussing this issue of reparations, who should be included and who should be excluded.
I'm very troubled by the tone and the tenor of the conversation around who should get reparations. We know that some people got off the boat earlier than other ones did. I mean, that's really it. You got off the boat in Jamaica or you got off the boat in the US, if you look at the triangular slave trade. So I don't think that these folks who are pushing this narrow inclusion are on the right path. And I stand with Dr. Cheryl Gills, who is on the commission and who is a colleague in the National African American Reparations Commission, which is convened by Dr. Ron Daniels. And what we really talk about is not just cash. I mean, there are a group of people who just want cash, but cash does not restore us necessarily. The previous two segments you had with the folk from Oklahoma talk about the loss of community, talk about the loss of both physical and mental health, talk about the marginalization of our sacred sites, which is part of what NARC is looking at, is where are the places where people were lynched, where thousands of people were lynched. And, they put me, I have to tell you all a funny story about me. Charles will laugh because he knows me. I've been at Library of Congress reading Ida B. Wells' Lynching Chronicles. And there was one story about a Black man who basically back in the day didn't have jobs. You walked the highway and found work. He hooked up with a white woman who was a widow who had land. The two of them developed a relationship, but of course white men were envious because this white woman had land and she was basically knocking boots with a brother. They busted the house one night and found them, she said, rape. So I'm reading this, and in the Library of Congress, Charles, I say, suck it now. So the brother came back, he said, ma'am, you cannot be back here in the Library of Congress making all this noise. So I said, here, you read this. So then he read it, and he said, hot damn. It was like, okay, I thought I couldn't make noise. They did put me out on that particular day. I did go back, I always do. But this is the history of what has happened to our people. So this town in Oklahoma is looking at federal public policy that attacks Black people. Federal public policy that attacks Black people. So there is indeed a case for a lawsuit as far as I'm concerned. But so was Tulsa. So, there are just so many. And the fact of the matter is that white America owes Black America, or I won't say white America, the United States, collectively conditioned, owes Black America. We have a wealth gap because we have had economic rape. And that's what we need to basically deal with. So this town in Oklahoma is doing it.
Yeah, and so Dr. Henry, let me ask you this. So you raise a good point, Dr. Malveaux, about it's not just cash. So Dr. Henry, as you think about it, beyond cash, what should reparations look like?
Certainly land is an important part of this. And I wanted to tag on to a point that Julianne made, because the initial discussion and the vote in California concerned descendants of slaves, but the California legislation and the old Conyers bill, HR 40, refer to action since slavery, because so often we get, well, I wasn't around, you weren't a slave, I wasn't around, then it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with actions that are occurring today. It actually has actions that are, in terms of voter suppression, in terms of school segregation that are occurring right now. So when we talk about harm, we're talking about current harm and harm that existed in my, when I grew up, the law limited who I could marry. The Loving case wasn't decided until 1967. So all of us have been impacted by this. But in terms of the land has become a kind of key, because the source of wealth of most families is land, is home ownership. A majority of whites own homes, a minority of blacks own homes. There's at least a 20% gap in that. Blacks have roughly 1/10 the wealth of whites, and that can be traced to land. And, we can go back to 1862 and 1866 for the Homestead Acts. When you look at the government's role, approximately 10% of all the land in the United States was given out through those Homestead Acts. 25%
to white immigrants.
To whites. And so 25% of whites today, adult whites, can trace their wealth back to that land grant in 1862.
Which
At the same time,
specifically excluded from.
We were excluded from. And this is the same period in which we're denying people who have been enslaved and worked any land at all. We're making sharecroppers out of them. We're putting them in debt peonage. And so to say somehow this didn't involve me and you're sitting on land that was given to you in 1862 or 1866 and denied to blacks, and then we work our way right on up through government actions in the GI Bill and being able to buy homes through the Veterans Administration, et cetera, and redlining. So this is not an ancient argument about slavery and who was enslaved and who wasn't. It's about current white privilege.
Well, if you go there, Dr. Henry, and you start talking about redlining, the GI Bill, the Homestead Act, that's an argument for a more expansive definition of the class of people that should benefit, right? So it
is, and I would think this would be a part of the national discussion around HR 40 in terms of inclusion. And we have various kinds of Mullen and Darity talk about a cash payment to each individual. People like Mary Berry and others talk about a kind of super fund that would fund.
But I'm saying the whole notion of if I were impacted by redlining, even if I can't trace my descendancy back to slavery, then I should be included in the class of people that receive reparations.
Yeah,
I don't think so. I mean, I would think so, but I think that there's this organization of crazy people. Their name is ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves. And their focus is to narrow who gets reparations. And I think that is an ahistorical position. I think that Dr. Henry would agree with me that when we look at who, what, when, where, and why, like I said, you got off the boat first. You got off the boat.
Let me ask you this. You're an economist, Dr. Malveaux. We heard the journalist, Emmanuel, from the Washington Post say that public opinion is changing over the last 30 years. He said about 40% he thought of white Democrats only, were in favor of some form of reparations. So that means we're making progress, but we still have a long way to go. That bill that's now being sponsored by Jackson Lee from Texas, the Dems think they have the votes in the House, definitely don't have the votes in the Senate. And this is just a study bill to study reparations. Yeah. But we continue to hear tremendous pushback. So, how do we get over that 40% threshold amongst Democrats, the folks that's supposed to be in the tent with us, the big tent party?
Well, they're not in the tent with us on this one. I think that it's very.
Talk to me about how you convince them, if you can. And I'm talking about.
I don't know that we can, Areva. The fact is, I don't know that we can. We're dealing with white people who don't like whiteness. They don't want to own what they've done. Nobody wants a little third grader to come home saying, "Oh, mommy, we had slaves." We don't want that. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is educating people about history. But people don't want to know history. They don't want to own history. And so you can always find a Black person who, as I testified June 19th, 2019, they found some little brother who was a pole dancer, actually, footnote. But anyway, who, I don't want reparations. I can make it on my own. Well, that's not the point. The point is you have a wealth gap because of deliberate public policy. The public policy was designed to sideline Black people. And so Dr. Henry has gone through some of the issues. as have I, in terms of FHA laws, in terms of redlining, in terms of school segregation, in terms of anti-affirmative action policies, in terms of exclusionary policy. There's a law, and I can't find it right now, where actually the New England School of Medicine could only admit one Jewess and one Negress per year. One Jewess and one, give me a you know what break. I mean, but things were written into law. A. Philip Randolph's entire career was about including Black people in union contracts. So we had previously been excluded. We can tell this story time and time and time again, and that's not the point. Some white people just don't want to hear it.
Yeah. And Dr. Henry, we know that. And, you know, we hear the argument. You said, Dr. Malveaux, right now, white people don't even want their kids taught Black history because they say it makes their children feel bad. And we hear the argument over and over again, Dr. Henry, that I didn't do that. People try to disavow any association, any responsibility. And I'm just wondering if we're going to get past that 40%. We got to do something, right? We got to be able to do something to move the needle if we're going to have this bill, or we're going to get Biden to do executive order to study, because we can't get the bill of reparations if we don't start with the study. So I'm just wondering, in your opinion, how can we move the needle?
Well, I think it's a mistake to focus too much on the national legislation. I mean, it was around 30 years before we got a hearing on the legislation. Yeah. We didn't have, the presidential candidates ran away from this issue for the 3 elections prior to this past election, when all the Democratic candidates acknowledged it and talked about it. Some even talked about, let's pay it out now. Biden was on the conservative side saying less studying, but that's progress. But I don't want to put all my eggs in that national Congress basket.
You think it's better?
Look at what's happening locally. Look at Bruce's Beach in Manhattanville, California. Look at the Berkeley City Council. Now, you may be shocked unless you were in Berkeley to realize that Berkeley just last week decided to hire a consultant to put forward some proposals on reparations. Now, Asheville, North Carolina, Evanston, Illinois, all these other places moved faster than Berkeley, California, but Berkeley's Black population has declined from 24% in the 1970s to 8% today. They're simply being gentrified out of Berkeley. And there's the realization that our Black population is going to disappear totally unless something happens here. So in a quote unquote liberal community like Berkeley, and Julianne will laugh because, the university is considered very liberal too, but the Black professors have been 3% of the university for 40 years. So, how liberal is it? So the same thing in terms of housing in Berkeley and in terms of city schools in Berkeley. So we're getting some action at the local level that should have been happening a long time ago. And California, for example, has recognized that the forced sterilization of women over a period of decades was a wrong and should be compensated, as it was in North Carolina, where 7,000 women were forcefully sterilized over a period of years. So I'm looking at the state levels and I'm looking at the local levels for the real momentum on this. And I think if we have successful cases, then we can apply pressure at the national level. But let's look where we've got the forces, we've got the resources, and produce some successes. In my book, I compare Rosewood to Tulsa and talk about some of the reasons why Rosewood was successful in getting reparations and Tulsa was not. And there was a prima facie, a stronger case in Tulsa, but politics and a whole bunch of other things entered into why Rosewood got it. So let's look at those cases and see where we can be successful.
Charles, I'm going to just respectfully disagree with you about something. I think that while the local initiatives are extremely important, the national legislation is also. And so I think we have to do a both and, not an either or. I think that we really do have to look at, Evanston, Robin Ruth Simmons is a rock star. Evanston, with the work she did on reparations. I think that we see several others. I think I give Gavin a few props, not many, but a few, for setting up the commission there in California. It hasn't had the outcome I would have liked, but I think we have that. But I think the national legislation is an important opportunity for us to talk about our history. And I think that Sheila Jackson Lee basically picked up the baton from John Conyers. He first introduced the legislation in 1989. So you're right, more than 30 years ago. She's done a brilliant job with that, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And you're also right, we won't get it out of the Senate. We know what the Senate is. They don't even want the sister to be on the Supreme Court. However, we have to keep pushing the national legislation because it keeps opening up the conversation about what has happened to Black people nationally. It's not just what happened in Evanston or in California, and people are going to debate. There was a national anti-Blackness that allowed enslavement, that supported enslavement, that could not pass an anti-lynching bill until this year, when 5,000 people had been lynched. So I just want us to not close out one avenue of the pursuit of reparations.
What do you think, Dr. Malveaux, should be? They've already voted in California 5-4, so they're going to go forward with this narrow class. Now the next debate for this California commission is, what do these reparations look like? So that's the next battlefield. In your opinion, and the work that you've done, you've already said it should be more than cash, but let's talk about the cash first, because a lot of people want to know about the cash. What should that cash look like? We know what the Japanese folks who got reparations after World War II, was it about $20,000 or so?
$1,000, yeah. That does not even begin to compensate for what Black people have gone through.
So what are we talking order of magnitude, in your opinion, should be the cash amount? Then we'll talk about what other things should be made available.
I haven't done the research on the cash. I know that Sandy Darity, who was a classmate of mine at MIT, so we come from the same swamp, if you will. And I did say swamp. But in any case, I know that he's done some number crunching, and I know people are looking at numbers as low as 100,000, as high as more. I won't say I don't care about the cash. I think the cash is important, Areva, but I think what's also important is to look at the restoring of our communities.
So what does that look like for you? What does restoring look like?
Once upon a time, we had 130 Black-owned banks. Now we have 23.
But I want you to focus on California. What do you want to see this commission do? It will set the cash aside. I'll ask Dr. Henry if he knows the number. But beyond the cash, what do you think this commission should recommend? Because it's just recommendations that then has to get passed by the California legislature. Both and Senator Bradford, who's the sponsor of this bill, is not hopeful. He's hopeful, but he's not certain that they even have all the votes, even though California has a Democratic majority in both its House and its Senate. But what should those recommendations include other than cash?
Land. There is a lot of state-owned land that could be partitioned to folks. We also see the loss of land, deliberate loss of land. People should have their land restored. I think that we're looking at an infrastructure that connects Black communities, which has been totally decimated by public policy in California. We have just a few left Black-owned newspapers. They need to be empowered and basically supported. I think that we want to look at education. The average Black student carries more student loan debt than any other demographic. Can our young people attend UC, Cal State, community college for free? I mean, I think that is something that will go a very long way towards closing the wealth gap. We know that when a person goes to college, they end up earning at least $1 million more than someone who didn't go. So to say open ramp, I mean, UC, Charles just mentioned, I think I left UC Berkeley about the time that Prop 209 had passed, and they had restricted basically our admission by restricting affirmative action. And we know that a UC degree is worth a lot. So that's reparations. Let our kids go to school for free.
All right, good point. Dr. Henry, I do want to end on this cash piece because a lot of people want to know. I'm just asking for the people that want to know, what are the amounts that you think this commission should recommend?
Well, I mean, the Darity book puts forth a number of numbers from, several hundred billion to $14 trillion, depending on how you want to calculate it. Is it lost wages? Is it the value of slaves in the country at the end of the war? All of that data is available. Yeah, and at one time when you talked about $1 trillion, people said that's crazy. Since COVID, it's apparent the government can write out a check for $1 trillion. So it's not inconceivable, but it depends on what you want to base the calculation on. And I would encourage those who are interested in that to look at the Darity book, because he goes through a number of formulations in terms of, it depends on what you calculate that. Is it 40 acres and a mule? If we had given every family 40 acres and a mule, what would that be worth today? That's one calculation, for example.
And just finally, Dr. Malveaux, what's your hope in terms of this whole conversation? There's some folks who are concerned that this conversation is starting to cause such a backlash that we may lose it, that it may dissipate, that we may regress. We see all kinds of efforts to suppress not just voting rights, the teaching of history in schools, public schools, colleges. What are you hoping comes out of this moment?
Well, this is a backlash that was long overdue. If you look at the letters between Abigail Adams and John Adams back in the 18th century, they talked about, chickens coming home to roost. That's not the term they used, but they talked about how we're going to have to deal with this. The fact is that enslavement is at the foundation of our nation, and people don't want to deal with it. You cannot bake a cake called America without dealing with enslavement. So when you look at that, what you end up looking at is all of the horrible things that have happened. My hope is that we'll talk about those things. I don't want little white children feeling bad. I want little white children feeling empowered and informed. I want not only little white children, but grown white people feeling empowered and informed, because once you own it, well, I always say when I do trainings, you name it, then you claim it. So you say enslavement is at the root of this, so what do we do about it? And I'm not saying that white folks have to go whip themselves and wear sackcloth and ashes. I'm saying that we have to have a public policy that allows Black people to be economically included in what happens in our country.
Great way to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Malveaux. Again, her book is Are We Better Off? And Dr. Henry, thank you as well. His book is long overdue. Great scholars working on these issues. And Dr. Henry, I hope you talk to your colleague from Berkeley and maybe you could give me some insights about how this commission is thinking about this, because California is moving pretty quickly, although it may not feel that way. We're definitely ahead of the curve. And as Steve Bradford, the senator that sponsored the bill, has said, as California goes, so does the rest of the nation. So maybe if California can get its study into the hands of the legislatures and it can get passed, a bill that gets on Gavin Newsom's desk and gets signed, maybe that'll be momentum for the federal piece to move, as well as for other states around the country to move as well. But thanks to both of you again for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Areva, for the opportunity. Appreciate you. Charles Henry, you better call me.
All right. I want to thank all of my guests this morning for this interesting conversation. I'm just so elated about reparations that we're able to have this conversation and to see that it's moved into the mainstream discourse. And it's not just for those on the fringes or people who think, oh my God, reparations will never happen. Remember, they said we never have a Black president, and we did. So I'm really hopeful that what's happening in California, what's happening in places like Evanston and Rhode Island and now Michigan can be the momentum that we need to move this conversation forward. And so much thanks and praise to Senator Jackson Lee out of Texas, who has taken this up, the mantle from John Conyers from Michigan, who introduced HR 40 every year that from 1989 until he actually passed away. So that mantle has been picked up by the Texas Congresswoman, and she is moving it forward. And we have a president that has at least said he's willing to look at a study bill. And if we can't get that study bill, maybe we get some executive action from that White House. This is an issue that's not going away. This giant has been awakened, and people are talking about this, and people are demanding that we address issues of generational wealth in this country. So we're here for it at the special report. Just some words to live by before I get out. If it were easy, everybody would do it. Yes, reparations, the conversation, the concept, who's included, who's not included. Is it money? Is it land? Is it free college tuition? Is it paying off student loan debt? This is a big, messy, and complicated subject matter. But just because it's messy and just because it's complicated doesn't mean there's not an answer to it. Doesn't mean we can't solve it. We are the country that's known for our innovation, that's known for solving the most intractable problems. So I am encouraged that this generation, my generation, the folks in leadership today are going to solve this problem. We're going to make Black folks whole. I know that sounds like a great big promise, but I am hopeful of that. I'm out, y'all be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.